everyone, and welcome back to Neuropsychology. So in the previous videos, we talked about a bunch of methods that we use in neuroscience research, and also some methods that are used in a hospital. So we're going to start off with the next chapter, which is all about our sensory systems. So in this video, it's going to be a short video about the introduction to our senses. We're going to talk about sensory receptors, and how these receptors transduce energy into action potentials in our 4 different systems. And then we're going to talk about receptive fields. And then in the next video, we are going to start to dive deep into one of the sensory systems, which is vision. Okay, so we may believe that what we see, hear, or touch, smell, and taste, that those are real things in the world. However, the only input our brain receives from the real world is a series of action potentials that are passed along the neurons of multiple sensory pathways, and then they go towards the brain. So although we experience visual and auditory sensations as different things, the nerve impulses are very similar, and they're nearly identical. And the neurons themselves are actually very similar too. So the different sensory systems turn energy, so for example light waves in vision, into nerve impulses. And in the next couple videos, we are going to cover some important sensory systems. So the first one we're going to cover in the next video is vision, and then we're going to talk about audition or hearing, about somatosensation or body senses, and then lastly, we are going to talk about taste and smell. Okay, so when you think about the different systems, such as vision or audition or body senses and taste and olfactions, the one we just talked about in the previous slide, you would think that they're very different, right? So each sensory system is actually organized according to a very similar hierarchical plan. So sensory receptors, which are very special receptors, they transduce or convert energy into neuroactivity or action potentials. So these sensory receptors connect to the cortex through a sequence of intervening relay neurons that allow each sensory system to mediate different responses to interact with other sensory systems. So sensory receptors only respond to a very narrow band of energy. So let's look at vision, for example. Down here I put a picture of the visible light we see. So the slice of electromagnetic energy visible to the human eye lies within a narrow range of about 400 nanometers, which we see as a color violet, to about a range of 700 nanometers, which we see as the color red. So other animals have sensory receptors that respond to different bands of energy. So an example is a butterfly who can actually see UV light waves. Isn't that cool? So as I said previously, sensory receptors transduce or convert energy into neuroactivity. So in vision, this energy that it transduces is light, or more specifically light waves. So in the visual system, light waves are converted into chemical energy in the photoreceptors, and that is converted into an action potential in the neurons. So here you see a picture of an eye, and here you see that light waves will go from this candle, will go into the eye, will go through the cornea and through the lens, and then it will create an inverted image on the retina. So the retina is all the way in the back of the eye, then it processes through the retina, and then eventually it goes through the optic nerve into the brain. And then eventually, when it goes into the brain, it is called an optic tract. So another one is audition. So it works a little bit different, but still has a similar pathway. So birds and frogs actually have a very narrow band of frequencies that they can hear compared to us. However, other animals such as whales or dolphins and dogs, they have a way bigger band of frequencies that they can hear compared to humans. So in hearing or audition, this energy that sensory receptors transduce into neuroactivity are the air pressure waves. So here I found a picture on the internet which technically shows a simple representation of air pressure waves. We're going to talk about these in more detail in later videos. So air pressure waves are converted into mechanical energy, and those activate the auditory receptor cells, which will eventually produce action potentials. So again, here's a very simplistic image. So when these air pressure waves go into the ear, it goes into the ear a little further, then eventually it gets to the eardrum. And when these air pressure waves hit the eardrum will start vibrating. Then because of that, it will make the ossicles vibrate. So ossicles are tiny little bones attached to the eardrum. Eventually, within this weird looking snail-like structure, the cochlea, there are tiny little hair cells, and whenever those move, an action potential will be created and it will be sent towards the brain. So don't worry, I know I just went over a bunch, but we are going to go over this in more detail in a later video. So in the somatosensory system, or how we feel touch or pain, mechanical energy activates receptor cells that are sensitive to touch or pressure. So somatosensory receptors generate action potentials. So, for example, when something slightly touches you, in the case of this image, you see a little feather, it moves the little hairs in your arm. And this causes stretch-sensitive channels, or ion channels, on the dendrites to open, which will then in turn cause for a nerve impulse or an action potential. In pain sensation, whenever there's tissue damage, that will release chemicals that kind of act like neurotransmitters to activate pain fibers that produce action potentials. So it's a tiny bit different for pain versus touch, but they technically follow the same pathway. And then eventually, when these neurons in our skin get action potentials, they will eventually send it through the spinal cord up towards our brain. So in taste and olfaction, again, it works a little bit differently. So for these two systems, chemical molecules that are carried in the air, for smell, for example, or in food, in taste, for example, they will attach to receptors, and then those receptors will cause neurons to activate these action potentials. So here in the image, you can see right here you have the olfactory bulb. So smell would go in here. And here you have the tongue with these little taste buds. So food normally, or also air that you can taste can also go in here. So you can see the olfactory receptor cells in the olfactory bulb. So here you have the olfactory bulb, and here you have these receptor cells that go down to the top of the nose. And then below, you can see these little taste buds or taste bud pores that connect to the gustatory nerve, which eventually will go all the way to the brain. So these are just very brief examples of how these sensation receptors work and how they transduce energy into action potentials. Okay, so before we go into next videos and we dive deep into the different senses, let's talk about receptive fields. So every receptor organ and cell has a receptive field. This receptive field is a specific part of the world to which it responds. So, for example, if you look at a point in front of you and if you focus your eyes on it, what you see in the world is your scope of your eye's receptive field. So each photoreceptor, which is the sensory receptor in your retina, points to a slightly different direction that has a unique receptive field to it. So technically, each photoreceptor has its own little unique view of the world. Receptive fields also help locate sensory events in space, and they also facilitate different actions in space. So because these receptive fields of adjacent sensory receptors may overlap, their relative different responses to events will help us localize different sensations. So here you see a picture. I think this one is in the skin, and here for this neuron, this will be the receptive field, and for this neuron, this will be the receptive field. So whenever you touch right here, this neuron will fire, and whenever you touch right here, this neuron will fire. However, sometimes these kind of overlap, and then if you touch in the middle, they will both overlap. They will both fire. So our sensory systems are organized to tell us what is happening in the world around us. But they also tell us what we ourselves are doing or what is going on inside of our bodies. So receptors that respond to external stimuli are called exteroceptive, and receptors that respond to our own activity or our internal state are interoceptive. So objects in the world that we see, that we can touch or that touch us, or those that we smell or taste, those act on exteroceptive receptors. And the ones that come from inside, such as hunger, proprioception, or headaches, those are things that act on the interoceptive receptors. So receptor density is also important in determining a sensory system sensitivity. So for example, there are way more tactile receptors on your fingers than there are on, for example, your arms. So this difference explains why the fingers can discriminate touch remarkably well, and the arm doesn't do that great of a job compared to your fingers. So you can prove this by moving the tips of, for example, two pencils or pens apart to different degrees as you touch different parts of the body. So the ability to recognize the presence of two pencil points close together is highest on body parts where there are more touch receptors. So this measurement is called the 2-point sensitivity. So on the picture on the right here, you can see where there are more tactile receptors on our body. So there are more on the ends of our fingers or on our lips or by our toes. So for example, with a 2-point sensitivity measure, the points of two, well, normally pencils, but of two pencils that you can discriminate as two different points is closer together than, for example, on your back, because there are more receptors on your fingers than there are on your back. The hierarchical code sent from sensory receptors through neural relays is then interpreted by the brain, especially in the neocortex, so the outside layer of our brain, and eventually is translated into perception, memory, and certain actions. So once sensory information is transduced, all sensory information from all sensory systems is encoded by action potentials that travel along the peripheral system nerves until they enter the brain or spinal cord tracts within the CNS. So the presence of a stimulus can be encoded by an increase or decrease in a neuron's discharge rate, and the amount of increase and decrease can encode the stimulus intensity. Okay, so this is the last slide before we move into the different senses. So how do we perceive sensations such as touch or smell or sound as different things, right? This is a good question. So different sensations are processed in distinct regions of the cortex. So you have a cortex for somatosensation, one for motor, one for vision, etc. So next to that, we also learn through experience to distinguish these systems. And the third part is that each sensory system has preferential link with certain behaviors, constituting a distinct neural wiring that helps keeps each system distinct at all organizational levels. So for example, a pain stimuli produces withdrawal response, whereas a touch or a fine touch or pressure stimuli will produce an approach response. So synesthesia is actually a really cool perceptual phenomenon in which stimulation of one sensory or cognitive pathway leads to an automatic involuntary experience in a second sensory cognitive pathway. So technically, there's kind of mixing of senses, and there are multiple people in this world that have that. So an example of that is that you can see music or you can taste music rather than just hearing it. Okay, so this is the end of the video, and I will see you guys back in the next video where we are going to talk about the visual system.